For most of my life, I believed generosity was one of the most beautiful things a person could offer. I believed that if you worked hard, treated people with kindness, and shared your success with the people you loved, life would naturally reward that kindness with gratitude and respect. Unfortunately, that's not always how the world works. Sometimes generosity attracts appreciation, but sometimes it attracts entitlement. Sometimes the very people you expect to celebrate your happiness quietly begin calculating how they can benefit from it. I learned that lesson on what should have been the happiest day of my parents' lives. A day that began with tears of joy, hugs, and 50 years of love being celebrated by an entire family. A day that eventually turned into one of the biggest betrayals we had ever experienced. Looking back now, I realized the warning signs were there from the beginning. I simply didn't recognize them because I was too focused on making everyone happy. My name is Claire Morgan, and I'm 56 years old. I own an architecture firm in Northern California that I built from scratch over 3 decades. My life has never been glamorous. There were no overnight success stories, no wealthy investors, and no lucky breaks that suddenly changed everything. My success came from thousands of ordinary days where I simply showed up and did the work. Long nights, difficult clients, sacrificed vacations, years of reinvesting money back into the company instead of spending it on myself. But I never complained because my biggest goal was never becoming rich. My biggest goal was creating freedom. Freedom for myself, freedom for my family, and most importantly, freedom to give something back to the 2 people who spent their entire lives giving everything to me. My parents, Eleanor and George, had been married for 50 years. 50 years is an extraordinary accomplishment nowadays. They survived financial struggles, illnesses, career changes, and every challenge life placed in front of them. Through all of it, they remained kind, humble, and deeply devoted to one another. My father spent 43 years teaching high school students, while my mother worked as a librarian. They never earned enormous salaries, but they created a beautiful life built on patience, consistency, and love. As a child, I never felt like we lacked anything because they somehow made ordinary things feel extraordinary. Ever since I was a teenager, my father had one dream. He wanted to retire near the ocean. Nothing extravagant, nothing luxurious. He simply loved sitting near the water and watching the waves roll in for hours. Every summer, he'd drive us to the California coast and spend entire afternoons quietly enjoying the view while my mother sat beside him reading a book. Over time, those afternoons became some of my favorite memories. Yet as life became more expensive and responsibilities increased, my parents slowly stopped talking about their dream. Not because they stopped wanting it, but because they accepted it probably wouldn't happen. Responsible people often do that. They quietly set their own dreams aside so other people can have opportunities instead. 3 years ago, I decided I was going to change that. Without telling anyone, I started visiting coastal towns every weekend looking for the perfect property. It took months, but eventually I found it. It wasn't a mansion. It wasn't enormous. It was simple and peaceful. A white house with blue shutters, a wraparound porch, and a direct view of the ocean. The moment I walked inside, I knew this was their home. I bought it immediately and spent 6 months secretly preparing everything. I placed my mother's favorite reading chair near a large window overlooking the sea. I built a small workshop in the garage for my father. I decorated every room with things they loved because this wasn't simply a house. It was my way of thanking them for an entire lifetime of sacrifices they had quietly made without ever asking for recognition. The day of their 50th anniversary finally arrived, and our entire family gathered at a restaurant overlooking the California coastline. My mother wore a blue dress my father had given her decades earlier, and my father looked happier than I'd seen him in years. There was laughter everywhere. Stories were being shared. Old photographs were passed around the table. It felt perfect. Toward the end of dinner, I stood up holding a small envelope and walked over to my parents. My hands were shaking slightly because I had imagined this moment for years. I handed the envelope to my father, and he looked confused at first because he assumed it was another anniversary card. Instead, inside were 2 house keys and a handwritten note. The note said, "Thank you for giving me a lifetime of love. Here's a lifetime of sunsets in return." For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Then my mother started crying while my father simply stared at the keys. He asked what they were for, and I smiled and told everyone to follow me. 20 minutes later, we pulled into the driveway of the beach house. My mother immediately covered her mouth with both hands, while my father stood completely still, staring at the ocean. Then he hugged me and quietly said that nobody had ever given them something this beautiful before. It was one of the happiest moments of my entire life. Unfortunately, while everyone else was admiring the house and enjoying the moment, I noticed something unusual. My in-laws, Margaret and Thomas, weren't looking at the ocean at all. They weren't admiring the view, taking pictures, or celebrating with everyone else. Instead, they were studying the property itself. Their eyes moved from the garage to the porch and then toward the backyard. Margaret smiled and said this would make a wonderful place for family vacations. Thomas immediately added that it was nice knowing there would always be room for everyone now. At the time, everyone smiled politely and moved on with the evening, but something about those comments bothered me immediately. There is a very noticeable difference between appreciating a gift and mentally claiming ownership of it. I felt that difference in my stomach the moment those words left their mouths. Unfortunately, I ignored my instincts because I didn't want to create unnecessary tension during such a beautiful day. Looking back now, I wish I had trusted that feeling. Because what nobody knew at the time was that my in-laws had already started making plans of their own. And within a few months, those plans would force my entire family into a battle none of us ever expected to fight. Over the next few weeks, my parents slowly settled into their new life by the ocean, and watching them do so became one of the greatest joys I had experienced in years. Every morning, my father would wake up early, make a cup of coffee, and sit on the porch watching the sunrise while my mother read one of her novels beside him. They looked peaceful in a way I hadn't seen since I was a child. Their entire energy had changed. They smiled more, laughed more, and somehow looked younger. It was almost as if the ocean itself had removed years of stress from their lives. Every Sunday I would drive down to visit them, and we'd spend hours talking, cooking, and walking along the shoreline together. It felt like life had finally rewarded them after decades of putting everyone else first. Unfortunately, that peaceful routine didn't last very long because I slowly started noticing something unusual. Margaret and Thomas were visiting far more often than everyone else. At first, I ignored it because they lived less than an hour away and everyone was still excited about the new house. But then those visits became longer. A 2-hour visit turned into an entire afternoon. An afternoon turned into dinner. Dinner eventually turned into overnight stays. Nobody had invited them to stay overnight, but somehow it started happening anyway. The first time I noticed something was truly wrong happened during one of my Sunday visits. I walked inside carrying groceries and immediately noticed several things that didn't belong there. Margaret had added decorative pillows throughout the living room, replaced a few lamps, and moved furniture around without asking anyone. My mother politely smiled and said Margaret was only trying to help, but I could already tell she looked slightly uncomfortable. Then I walked into the kitchen and noticed something else. Several cabinets had been reorganized. My mother laughed awkwardly and explained that Margaret believed the kitchen would be easier to use if everything was arranged differently. Again, I smiled politely because I didn't want to create tension, but something felt wrong. There is an invisible line between helping and taking over, and Margaret was beginning to cross it. The most frustrating part was that she did everything under the disguise of kindness. People like that are difficult to confront because they never appear aggressive. They present their control as generosity. They disguise entitlement as helpfulness. If you challenge them, they immediately act offended and accuse you of being ungrateful. Over the next month, things slowly became stranger. Margaret began referring to the house as our beach house instead of your beach house. The first time she said it, I thought maybe it was accidental. Then she kept saying it. She'd tell friends she was spending the weekend at our beach house. She'd tell neighbors she'd be staying there during summer. Every time I heard those words, my stomach tightened slightly because language matters. People reveal their intentions long before they reveal their actions. Meanwhile, Thomas began treating the garage as if it belonged to him. My father had built a small workshop there, where he enjoyed spending his mornings repairing old furniture and creating little projects for Oliver, my nephew. One afternoon, Thomas arrived carrying several boxes and started placing his own tools inside the workshop without asking. My father politely said there wasn't enough room, but Thomas laughed and said they would make it work. Again, nobody wanted to argue because everyone was trying to protect the peace. Looking back now, that's exactly how these situations become dangerous. Families often confuse avoiding conflict with maintaining harmony. In reality, avoiding conflict simply teaches entitled people that boundaries don't exist. One evening, my mother called me sounding unusually quiet. She wasn't upset exactly, but I could tell something was bothering her. She explained that Margaret had invited several of her own friends to the beach house for a weekend gathering without asking permission first. I immediately stopped what I was doing because this wasn't a small issue anymore. This was my parents' retirement home, not a vacation property people could reserve whenever they felt like it. My mother explained that Margaret had already started planning menus and activities as if she were hosting an event at her own residence. Then my mother said something that genuinely upset me. She admitted she didn't know how to say no because she didn't want to hurt anyone's feelings. Hearing that immediately reminded me of why my parents had always been vulnerable to people like Margaret. My parents were incredibly kind, but kind people sometimes struggle with boundaries because they worry too much about disappointing others. Unfortunately, manipulative people recognize that weakness very quickly. The following Saturday, I decided to visit unexpectedly. The moment I pulled into the driveway, my instincts immediately told me something was wrong. There were 4 unfamiliar cars parked outside. Music was playing inside the house, and laughter echoed from the porch. I walked through the front door and froze. Nearly 10 people were inside. Some were cooking. Others were drinking wine. A few were sitting on the porch admiring the ocean. Meanwhile, my parents sat quietly in the corner, looking more like guests than homeowners. Margaret immediately walked over and greeted me enthusiastically, as if everything was perfectly normal. She said she hoped I didn't mind because everyone was enjoying themselves. That sentence immediately irritated me because there was a very important word she didn't use. She never said she hoped my parents didn't mind. Instead, she asked if I minded, as if I was somehow responsible for approving what was happening. My father smiled politely while my mother looked uncomfortable, and in that moment, I realized something very serious was happening. The dream home I had given my parents was slowly being taken away from them, without anyone even noticing. That evening, after everyone left, I sat outside with my parents watching the sunset. My father stayed unusually quiet for several minutes before finally speaking. He admitted he didn't want to upset anyone, but he no longer felt completely comfortable inside his own house. Hearing those words broke my heart, because that sentence alone meant everything had already gone too far. Nobody should ever feel like a guest inside their own home. My mother quietly agreed and admitted she was becoming anxious every time her phone rang because she assumed Margaret was calling to announce another visit. Then my father said something I'll never forget. He said he didn't want to spend the final chapter of his life asking permission to enjoy his own retirement. The moment he said that, I made a decision. I wasn't going to allow anyone to take this away from them. What I didn't know yet was that Margaret and Thomas weren't simply acting entitled anymore. They had already started making much bigger plans, and within a few weeks, they would do something that would force me into the biggest confrontation our family had ever experienced. Over the next 2 weeks, I decided not to confront anyone immediately because experience had taught me something important about people who slowly cross boundaries. If you react too early, they make you look unreasonable. They convince everyone you're overreacting. They accuse you of being possessive, dramatic, or selfish. Instead, I wanted to observe. I wanted to understand exactly how far Margaret and Thomas intended to take things, because by this point, I was convinced this was no longer accidental behavior. One Wednesday afternoon, my mother called me while I was at work. She sounded nervous and asked if I had given Margaret permission to make changes to the guest bedroom. I immediately said no and asked what she meant. My mother explained that Margaret had purchased new bedding, removed some furniture, and reorganized the room entirely. At first I thought maybe she was simply helping decorate. Then my mother said something that made my stomach tighten. Margaret had started referring to that room as her room. For several seconds, I sat there staring at my computer screen, trying to process what I was hearing. There is a huge difference between staying somewhere occasionally and claiming a permanent space inside someone else's home. At that moment, I realized this was becoming much more serious than I originally thought. That weekend, I drove down to the beach house without telling anyone I was coming. The moment I walked inside, I noticed more changes. New towels were hanging in the bathroom. Different dishes had appeared in the kitchen. A set of keys sat on the counter that didn't belong to my parents. I walked over and picked them up immediately. My mother saw me holding them and quietly admitted that Margaret had made copies because she said it would make visits easier. Hearing that instantly made my chest tighten. Nobody had asked me. Nobody had asked my parents. Someone had simply decided to create access to a property that didn't belong to them. Then my father said something that upset me even more. He admitted he didn't know how to object because every time he tried to say something, Margaret would laugh and say that family shouldn't be so formal with each other. Unfortunately, that's how manipulative people operate. They make healthy boundaries sound unreasonable. They turn normal expectations into acts of selfishness. Eventually, people stop speaking up because they're exhausted from constantly defending their own rights. Later that afternoon, something happened that completely changed my approach. We were all sitting on the porch watching the ocean when Margaret casually mentioned that she and Thomas were already discussing spending the entire summer there next year. My father looked confused and politely reminded her that they lived only 45 minutes away. Margaret laughed and said it would save them from all the driving. Then Thomas added that retirement homes are much more enjoyable when multiple generations share them together. I immediately noticed my parents exchange nervous glances because they understood exactly what was happening. This wasn't a suggestion anymore. It was an assumption. Margaret and Thomas were no longer asking to visit. They were planning a future that included permanent access to a house they didn't own. That's when I finally spoke up. I calmly explained that this wasn't a family vacation property. It was my parents' retirement home, and they deserved complete freedom to enjoy it however they wanted. The entire atmosphere changed immediately. Margaret smiled politely, but I could see irritation behind her expression. She said she was only trying to help everyone stay connected. Then she added a sentence that revealed everything. She said families should share blessings instead of hoarding them. The moment she said the word hoarding, I knew exactly what she thought of me. In her mind, I wasn't protecting my parents. I was preventing her from getting something she felt entitled to receive. Over the following days, something even stranger began happening. Family members started contacting me. My sister Amanda asked if I was being too strict. My cousin suggested I should let everyone enjoy the house together. One uncle even joked that I was becoming territorial. Listening to these comments made me realize how easily people accept false narratives. Margaret had quietly started planting seeds. She wasn't telling people she wanted ownership. She was telling them I was preventing family togetherness. It was an incredibly smart strategy, because nobody wants to be seen as selfish. For a moment, I almost doubted myself. Then I reminded myself of something important. Protecting someone's boundaries is not selfish, especially when those boundaries belong to two elderly people who spent their entire lives sacrificing for others. That realization immediately erased every ounce of guilt I was feeling. 3 days later, my father called me sounding deeply upset. He explained that he had gone to the garage that morning and discovered several of his tools were gone. At first, he assumed he'd misplaced them. Then Thomas casually mentioned he had taken them home because he wanted to finish a project later in the week. My father said he didn't know how to respond because he felt embarrassed even having to ask for his own belongings back. Hearing that sentence broke my heart. Nobody should ever feel embarrassed asking for their own property. That's when I realized the problem had become emotional. This was no longer about a house. This was about my parents slowly losing ownership over their own lives. Every small act was adding up. Every tiny compromise was creating a bigger problem. The people I loved most were becoming uncomfortable inside a dream that was supposed to bring them peace. That evening, I sat in my office thinking about everything that had happened over the previous months. Then I did something I should have done much earlier. I gathered every document related to the house: property deeds, ownership papers, insurance records, security system information, every single file. As I reviewed everything, I felt calmer because facts don't care about emotions. Facts create clarity. Then I noticed something that genuinely alarmed me. During the last utility update, someone had attempted to add another emergency contact to the property records. The request hadn't gone through because my signature was required, but the name attached to the request immediately made my stomach drop. It was Margaret. For several seconds, I simply stared at the screen because that wasn't a misunderstanding anymore. That wasn't overstepping a boundary. That was a deliberate action. Somebody had actively tried to insert themselves into the official records of a house that didn't belong to them. At that exact moment, I knew the situation was about to become a confrontation. Because people don't accidentally attempt to add themselves to property records. They do that when they've already convinced themselves they belong there. And unfortunately, Margaret and Thomas were about to make a decision that would force me to fight for my parents in a way I never imagined I'd have to. The following week was the moment everything changed. Up until that point, I still believed this situation could be solved through simple conversations and healthy boundaries. I thought maybe Margaret and Thomas had become too comfortable and simply needed a reminder that this was my parents' retirement home, not a shared family property. Unfortunately, I was giving them far too much credit. Sometimes people slowly cross boundaries because they are careless. Other times, they cross boundaries because they genuinely believe they deserve what belongs to someone else. Margaret and Thomas belong to the second category. That realization became impossible to ignore one Friday evening when my mother called me sounding more anxious than I had ever heard her before. She explained that Margaret had invited everyone over for a family meeting on Sunday. I immediately asked why she was organizing a family meeting inside my parents' home, and my mother quietly admitted she didn't know. The fact that nobody had questioned it immediately told me something was very wrong. Somewhere along the way, everyone had slowly accepted Margaret's authority inside a house that wasn't hers. That didn't happen overnight. It happened one small decision at a time until eventually nobody noticed it anymore. Sunday arrived, and I drove to the beach house early because I wanted to observe everything before anyone else arrived. The moment I pulled into the driveway, I immediately noticed several things that didn't belong there. Additional folding chairs had been set up on the porch. Extra decorations were hanging near the entrance. Margaret had somehow turned a family gathering into an event she was hosting herself. My father sat quietly on the porch holding a cup of coffee, and I could immediately tell he looked exhausted. He smiled when he saw me, but it wasn't his normal smile. It was the smile people wear when they're trying not to worry others. My mother walked outside moments later and admitted she was nervous because she had no idea what Margaret planned to announce. Hearing that sentence upset me because homeowners should never feel nervous inside their own home. That alone told me things had already gone much too far. Over the next hour, family members started arriving. Amanda came with her husband. Kevin arrived with his children. Several cousins joined as well. Everyone looked relaxed and happy because nobody understood the seriousness of what was happening. Then Margaret stood up and cleared her throat as if she were about to give a formal presentation. She smiled and announced that she had exciting news for everyone. Then she explained that she and Thomas had already begun discussing plans to turn the beach house into a permanent family retreat. She talked about assigning rooms, creating holiday schedules, and organizing annual gatherings. At first, I honestly thought she was joking. Then I realized she was completely serious. She had even printed out a calendar and highlighted weekends she planned to reserve throughout the following year. For several seconds, the entire room remained silent because nobody quite understood what they were hearing. Then she said something that immediately changed the atmosphere. She smiled and explained that my parents were getting older and would eventually need more support, so she believed the house should become a place where everyone could stay whenever they wanted. On the surface, her words sounded thoughtful. That's what made her so dangerous. She always wrapped entitlement inside kindness. But beneath those words was a very different message. She wasn't offering support. She was creating access. There is a huge difference between helping someone and positioning yourself to control part of their life. I looked at my parents immediately. My mother was staring down at her hands while my father looked deeply uncomfortable. Neither of them said anything because they didn't want conflict. Unfortunately, their silence was exactly what Margaret expected. Then several family members started agreeing with her. Amanda said it sounded like a beautiful idea. One cousin said it would keep everyone connected. Another relative joked that we'd finally have a family vacation home. Listening to all of them speak made me realize something important. Most people weren't being malicious. They simply didn't understand what was happening. They were seeing a carefully packaged version of reality instead of the truth. Nobody understood that my parents had already started feeling like guests inside their own home. Nobody understood that boundaries had already been crossed dozens of times. That's when I finally stood up and spoke. I calmly explained that this wasn't a shared family retreat. It wasn't a vacation house. It wasn't an investment property. It was my parents' retirement home, and every decision regarding that house belonged exclusively to them. The room immediately became quiet. Margaret smiled politely before speaking, but her tone had changed. She said she didn't understand why I was being so protective. Then she said families should share blessings instead of controlling them. For a brief moment, several people nodded in agreement. Then she added something that genuinely shocked me. She said she was only trying to create a future for everyone before it was too late. The implication behind those words immediately angered me, because she was essentially treating my parents as though they were already losing their independence. I looked directly at her and calmly asked a very simple question. I asked whether my parents had requested any of this. The entire room went silent because everyone already knew the answer. My mother quietly shook her head. Then my father finally spoke. My father was one of the gentlest people I had ever known. Throughout my entire life, I had rarely seen him angry. But that afternoon, something inside him finally changed. He calmly explained that he appreciated everyone's love and support, but he wanted to spend his retirement enjoying peace, not managing schedules and accommodating visitors every weekend. Then he said something that immediately made the entire room silent. He said this house was the first thing he had ever received that existed entirely for him and my mother. Hearing those words nearly broke my heart because they revealed a truth I hadn't fully understood before. My parents had spent their entire lives giving things away. Time, energy, opportunities, dreams. This house was the first time someone had given something back to them without asking for anything in return. Unfortunately, Margaret didn't stop there. She looked disappointed and said she was simply trying to think long-term. Then she revealed something that nobody expected. She admitted she had already started looking into legal options for creating a shared family trust around the property. The moment she said those words, my entire body went cold. For several seconds, nobody spoke because everyone was trying to process what they had just heard. She had actually explored ways to legally attach herself to a property that didn't belong to her. At that exact moment, every doubt I had disappeared. This wasn't entitlement anymore. This was a plan. And unfortunately for Margaret, she had just made the biggest mistake of her entire life. Because the moment she revealed her intentions publicly, she gave me permission to stop being polite. And what happened next would change our family forever. After Margaret revealed she had already explored legal options regarding the property, the atmosphere inside the house changed instantly. A few minutes earlier, everyone was treating this like a simple family disagreement. Now people were realizing something much more serious was happening. There is a very big difference between being overexcited about a family gift and actively researching ways to attach yourself to someone else's property. Those are two completely different things. I looked around the room and could see confusion spreading across everyone's faces. Amanda stopped smiling. Kevin leaned back in his chair and folded his arms. Even some of the cousins looked uncomfortable. Margaret immediately sensed that the room was shifting against her, so she did what people like her often do when they start losing control. She softened her voice and tried to make herself look misunderstood. She said she was only trying to think ahead because families should prepare for the future together. On the surface, those words sounded harmless, but I wasn't listening to the words anymore. I was paying attention to the pattern. People reveal themselves through repeated behavior, and Margaret's behavior had become impossible to ignore. I calmly walked inside the house and returned with a folder containing every document related to the property. Then I placed the folder directly on the table in front of everyone. There was no anger in my voice because anger wasn't necessary anymore. Facts were enough. I explained that the house was solely owned by me and legally protected for my parents' use during their lifetime. There were no shared ownership clauses, no family agreements, and no future arrangements involving anyone else. Everything was very clear. My parents would enjoy the home exactly as they wanted, for as long as they wanted, without interference from anyone. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then Margaret looked visibly uncomfortable for the first time since all of this began. People who thrive on assumptions often become nervous when reality enters the conversation, because reality is difficult to manipulate. Facts don't bend to emotions. Facts don't respond to guilt. Facts simply exist. Then Thomas attempted to change the subject by saying everyone was taking things too seriously. He laughed awkwardly and said they were only trying to be involved. But his timing actually made things worse because my father finally spoke up again. He explained that being involved and taking over were completely different things. Then he calmly listed everything that had happened over the previous months. The copied keys, the overnight stays, the reorganized rooms, the events hosted without permission, the workshop tools being taken home. Every single example sounded worse when spoken aloud because sometimes people don't realize how inappropriate their actions are until someone presents all the facts together. By the time my father finished speaking, the room was completely silent. Then something happened that surprised everyone. Amanda stood up and apologized to my parents. She admitted she had misunderstood the situation. She said she originally believed everyone was simply enjoying the beach house together, but now she realized there had been ongoing pressure for months. One by one, other family members started speaking as well. Kevin admitted he should have paid more attention. My aunt apologized for assuming I was overprotective. Even a cousin admitted Margaret had been presenting a very different version of events whenever she talked to relatives. Listening to everyone speak, I realized something important. Most people are not bad people. They simply make decisions based on incomplete information. Unfortunately, manipulative people understand that extremely well. They know if they can control the story, they can temporarily control the outcome. Margaret immediately became defensive after realizing people were no longer supporting her. She said she was being unfairly judged and accused everyone of turning against her. Then she said something that instantly revealed her true feelings. She said she couldn't understand why everyone was acting as if she were a stranger when she was part of the family too. At first glance, that statement sounded reasonable. Then I realized something. She was trying to create a false choice. Nobody was questioning whether she was family. They were questioning why she believed being family automatically gave her access to someone else's property. There is a huge difference between belonging to a family and believing you are entitled to everything that family owns. Healthy families understand that difference. Unhealthy people often don't. The conversation became much quieter after that. Nobody was arguing anymore because everyone had finally reached the same conclusion. Then my mother did something that genuinely surprised me. She stood up, walked toward Margaret, and calmly thanked her for every visit she had made over the past few months. Then she said something that I'll probably remember forever. She said, "Kindness is only beautiful when it's freely given." The moment kindness starts expecting ownership in return, it stops being kindness entirely. Hearing those words nearly brought tears to my eyes because my mother had finally found her voice. For decades, she had spent her life protecting other people's feelings. Now, for the first time in a long time, she was protecting her own peace instead. Over the next hour, everyone slowly left the house. There was no dramatic screaming, no giant argument, and no explosive ending. Sometimes real life doesn't work that way. Sometimes the most powerful moments are incredibly quiet. Margaret and Thomas gathered their belongings without saying much. Before leaving, Margaret looked around the house one last time. For a moment, she looked disappointed, almost shocked, as if she genuinely couldn't understand why things had turned out this way. That was perhaps the saddest part of the entire situation. Somewhere along the way, she had convinced herself that she deserved something she had never earned. People can become very dangerous when they start confusing access with ownership and generosity with obligation. Later that evening, I sat on the porch with my parents watching the sunset. The ocean looked exactly the same as it had on the day I gave them the house. The waves continued rolling toward the shore. Seagulls flew overhead. The breeze carried that familiar salty smell through the air. Everything looked peaceful again. My father smiled and admitted he had been worried for months that he'd eventually lose control of the one dream he'd waited his entire life to enjoy. My mother quietly agreed and said she had started feeling anxious every time her phone rang because she expected another announcement or another uninvited gathering. Hearing that made me realize something important. Protecting someone's peace is one of the greatest gifts you can ever give them. Sometimes love isn't about providing more. Sometimes love is about protecting what already exists. Unfortunately, the story wasn't over yet. Because while everyone believed the situation had finally ended, a phone call arriving 2 days later would reveal something none of us expected, and the truth hidden inside that phone call would completely change the way our entire family viewed Margaret and Thomas forever. 2 days after everyone left the beach house, life felt peaceful again for for the first time in months. My parents had returned to their normal routine. Every morning, my father sat on the porch drinking coffee while my mother read her books beside him. Their smiles slowly returned, and the anxiety that had been following them around for weeks finally seemed to disappear. I genuinely believed the situation was over. I thought everyone had learned an important lesson, and we could all move forward. Unfortunately, life has a strange way of reminding us that unresolved motives rarely disappear overnight. Sometimes people don't reveal their true intentions until they realize they're about to lose something they desperately wanted. That reminder arrived on a quiet Tuesday afternoon while I was sitting in my office reviewing client plans. My phone rang, and I immediately recognized the number. It was my cousin Jennifer. Her voice sounded serious, and she asked if I had a few minutes to talk privately. The moment she said that, my instincts immediately woke up because private conversations after family conflicts almost always mean one thing. Somebody knows something they haven't shared yet. Jennifer explained that she had recently met one of Margaret's longtime friends at a community event, and during their conversation, something unusual came up. Apparently, Margaret and Thomas had been dealing with major financial problems for over a year. At first, I wasn't shocked because financial difficulties happen to many people. Then Jennifer told me something much more alarming. Margaret had been openly talking about downsizing because they could no longer maintain their own home comfortably. She had also mentioned multiple times that she hoped the beach house would eventually become part of the family's shared future. Hearing those words immediately made everything click inside my head. Suddenly, every action from the previous months made perfect sense. The overnight stays, the copied keys, the reorganized rooms, the family gathering schedules. None of it was random. None of it was accidental. They weren't trying to create family memories. They were trying to create a backup plan for themselves. For several minutes after hanging up the phone, I simply sat there staring at my desk. I wasn't angry anymore because anger had already passed weeks earlier. Instead, I felt disappointed. Deeply disappointed. There is something especially painful about discovering that someone's kindness wasn't actually kindness at all. It was strategy. Looking back now, I realized they had been preparing for this long before my parents ever moved into the house. Every compliment, every helpful gesture, every offer of support suddenly looked different. That's one of the hardest things about betrayal. It forces you to revisit old memories and wonder which parts were genuine and which parts were carefully planned. Unfortunately, once trust breaks, even beautiful memories become difficult to revisit because uncertainty starts attaching itself to everything. That evening, I drove to the beach house to talk to my parents. We sat on the porch watching the ocean while I carefully explained what Jennifer had told me. My mother looked surprised at first, but my father wasn't surprised at all. In fact, he quietly admitted something that immediately caught my attention. About 6 weeks earlier, Thomas had casually asked him what would happen to the property someday if both of them became unable to live there. At the time, my father thought it was a harmless question. Now he realized it wasn't harmless at all. It was research. Sometimes people ask questions not because they are curious, but because they are collecting information. That realization made all three of us sit silently for a few moments because it confirmed something we didn't want to accept. Margaret and Thomas hadn't become attached to the house emotionally. They had become attached to it strategically. Later that night, my mother admitted something that broke my heart. She said she felt guilty for not speaking up sooner. She believed she had accidentally allowed the situation to grow because she didn't want to disappoint anyone. I immediately told her she had nothing to apologize for because kindness is not a weakness. The problem wasn't her kindness. The problem was that someone else decided to exploit it. That's a distinction many people struggle to understand. Good people often blame themselves after being manipulated because they think being trusting was their mistake. It wasn't. The mistake belongs to the person who chose to abuse that trust. Hearing those words seemed to relieve my mother because she smiled for the first time that evening and quietly nodded. The following morning, something unexpected happened. Margaret called me directly. It was the first time she had contacted me since the family gathering. Her voice sounded softer than usual, almost hesitant. She said she wanted to apologize and hoped we could move past everything. On the surface, the conversation sounded sincere. Then she said something that immediately raised another red flag. She suggested creating a new arrangement where everyone could use the house occasionally under certain rules. The moment she said that, I understood something important. She still wasn't letting go. Even after everything that had happened, she was still trying to negotiate access. Some people don't understand boundaries because they've spent their entire lives viewing boundaries as obstacles instead of limits that deserve respect. I calmly thanked her for the apology and politely declined the suggestion. Then I said something that needed to be said. I explained that the beach house had one purpose and one purpose only. It existed to give my parents the peaceful retirement they had waited 50 years to enjoy. Nothing more, nothing less. There would be no schedules, no shared arrangements, and no compromises involving ownership or access. For several seconds she didn't speak. Then she quietly said she understood. The interesting thing was that for the first time since all of this began, her voice sounded smaller somehow. Not defeated exactly, more like someone finally realizing reality wasn't going to bend in their favor anymore. That evening, I sat alone on my back patio thinking about the entire situation. Then I remembered something my grandfather used to say. He believed generosity should always have doors but never loose foundations. In other words, you should always welcome people into your life, but never give them the power to rearrange it. Looking back now, I realized that's exactly what happened here. My parents opened their doors, but other people started treating those open doors as ownership papers. It's an easy mistake to miss because it doesn't happen overnight. It happens one tiny compromise at a time until eventually someone is standing inside your life, acting as if they belong there permanently. Unfortunately, while we were finally starting to move forward, one final surprise was waiting for us. Because 3 weeks later, an envelope would arrive in the mail that would force our entire family to confront one last uncomfortable truth. And once that truth was revealed, nobody would ever look at Margaret and Thomas the same way again. 3 weeks passed peacefully after my conversation with Margaret, and for the first time in months, it genuinely felt as though life was returning to normal. My parents looked happier again. The tension had disappeared from their faces, and their routines finally belonged to them once more. Every morning, my father sat outside drinking coffee while my mother read her books beside him, and every Sunday I visited to cook dinner with them and watch the sunset. It felt like we had finally protected the life they deserved. Then one Thursday afternoon, everything changed again. My mother called and told me an envelope had arrived in the mail addressed to both of them. She said she didn't understand what it was because there was no return address. I immediately told her not to throw it away and drove down to the beach house after work. The moment I arrived, I sat at the dining room table and opened the envelope carefully. Inside were several pages of printed documents and a handwritten note. At first, I thought it might be another misunderstanding. Then I started reading, and my stomach immediately dropped. Margaret had written a letter explaining that she felt deeply hurt by how the family had treated her, and that she believed she deserved recognition for all the support she had provided over the years. Then she attached a list of expenses she claimed to have invested into the beach house, including decorations, kitchen items, furniture accessories, and various improvements she said had increased the value of the property. For several minutes, none of us spoke because the entire situation felt surreal. The total amount she listed wasn't enormous, but that wasn't the issue. The issue was the message behind it. The list wasn't about money. It was about creating a sense of ownership. Every pillow, every towel, every decoration had been documented as if she were building a case for contribution. Then we reached the final page, and that's when things became very clear. She had written that because she invested time, energy, and money into making the house functional for everyone, she hoped future decisions would include her input. Reading that sentence immediately reminded me of everything we had been dealing with from the beginning. She still didn't understand boundaries. Even after multiple conversations and family confrontations, she continued seeing the house as a shared opportunity instead of what it actually was. Looking over at my parents, I could tell they weren't angry anymore. They looked tired. That's often what happens when people experience prolonged entitlement. Anger eventually fades and exhaustion takes its place. That evening, I called a small family meeting at my parents' house. Everyone arrived quietly because by this point, nobody wanted more drama. My sister Amanda came, Kevin came, and several close relatives joined us as well. I passed the letter around so everyone could read it themselves. Nobody interrupted while people read because the words spoke for themselves. Then something interesting happened. For the first time since this entire situation began, nobody defended Margaret. Nobody suggested compromise. Nobody said I was overreacting. The room remained silent because everyone had finally reached the same conclusion. This wasn't about kindness anymore. This wasn't about family togetherness. This was about someone repeatedly trying to establish a permanent claim over something that never belonged to them in the first place. Sometimes people need repeated evidence before they accept difficult truths. That's exactly what had happened here. Then Amanda spoke up. She admitted she felt guilty because she had unintentionally supported Margaret during the early months. She said she genuinely believed everyone was trying to create happy family memories together. Looking back now, she realized how carefully the entire situation had been presented. Margaret never demanded ownership directly. She created comfort first, then familiarity, then expectation. Finally, she attempted influence. Hearing Amanda explain it out loud made everyone realize something important. Entitlement rarely arrives aggressively at the beginning. It arrives politely. It enters through kindness, grows through silence, and expands through unchallenged assumptions. By the time people recognize it, it often feels normal. That's why boundaries are so important. Boundaries don't exist to keep good people away. They exist to protect good people from those who quietly take advantage of them. Later that evening, my mother stood up and walked toward the window overlooking the ocean. She remained silent for a few moments before turning back toward all of us. Then she said something that I'll remember forever. She said she spent most of her life trying to avoid disappointing people because she believed keeping everyone happy was part of being a good person. But now she understood something different. A good person isn't someone who sacrifices their peace to satisfy everyone else. A good person is someone who protects their peace while still treating others with kindness and respect. Hearing those words nearly brought tears to my eyes because my mother had changed tremendously throughout this experience. The woman who once struggled to say no was now confidently protecting her own happiness. That, more than anything else, made me feel proud. The next morning, my father did something that quietly closed an entire chapter of this story. He gathered every decorative item Margaret had brought into the house and packed them neatly into several boxes. There was no anger involved, no revenge, no bitterness. Then he drove those boxes to her house and left them at the front door with a simple note. The note said, "Thank you for your generosity, but our home is finally complete." When he told me later that afternoon, I smiled because those 8 words perfectly summarized everything we'd learned. Sometimes closure doesn't require arguments. Sometimes closure is simply reclaiming your own space, reclaiming your own peace, reclaiming your own life. Over the next few days, something remarkable happened. Nobody spoke about the beach house anymore. Family dinners returned to normal. Conversations became lighter. Everyone seemed more relaxed. It was almost as if a heavy cloud had finally lifted from above us. Looking back now, I realize that unresolved tension affects everyone, even the people who aren't directly involved. The moment the situation ended, everyone could breathe again. That's often how healthy boundaries work. They don't create distance. They create clarity. They remind everyone where responsibilities begin and where they end. As I sat on the porch with my parents watching another sunset, my father smiled and said something simple that carried enormous meaning. He said he finally felt at home again. Hearing those words reminded me why I bought the house in the first place. It was never about luxury. It was never about property values or ocean views. It was about giving 2 extraordinary people a peaceful final chapter after a lifetime of sacrifices. That peace had almost been taken away, but thankfully, we protected it in time. What none of us realized then was that this experience would continue teaching us lessons long after it ended. Because 1 year later, our entire family would gather at that same beach house once again. But this time, the atmosphere would be completely different. And that final evening together would reveal the most important lesson of all. 1 year passed much faster than any of us expected. Life slowly returned to normal, and for the first time in a very long time, everybody looked peaceful again. Every morning, my father sat on the porch with a cup of coffee while watching the sunrise over the ocean. My mother sat beside him, reading one of her books while listening to the waves. Their entire energy had changed, and they looked happier than they had in years. Every Sunday, I drove to the beach house and spent the afternoon cooking dinner with them. Every single time I arrived, I noticed the same thing. Nobody looked anxious anymore, and nobody looked worried about unexpected visitors or uncomfortable conversations. They were simply enjoying the life they had always dreamed about. Watching them become peaceful again reminded me why I bought the house in the first place. It was never about owning an expensive property near the ocean. It was never about showing people that I was successful. It was about giving two extraordinary people a chance to enjoy life after spending decades taking care of everyone else. Sometimes we forget that the people who spend their entire lives helping others also deserve something beautiful for themselves. My parents had spent 50 years sacrificing their own dreams, and seeing them finally enjoy one of those dreams felt better than any business success I had ever achieved in my life. Our family changed because of everything that happened. We stopped avoiding difficult conversations, and we stopped pretending everything was fine when it was not. If someone felt uncomfortable, they said so immediately, and if someone needed privacy, everybody respected it. Healthy boundaries became normal inside our family. Looking back now, I realize many of our problems were not caused by one person alone. They were caused by silence. Silence allowed assumptions to grow, and assumptions eventually became expectations that nobody had ever agreed to in the first place. Once we started communicating honestly, our relationships immediately became stronger. My mother changed the most. She no longer worried about disappointing everybody around her, and she no longer believed being a good person meant sacrificing her own happiness. My father changed too because he finally allowed himself to enjoy life without feeling responsible for everyone else. Even Margaret and Thomas slowly changed over time. We did not remove them from our lives because that was never our goal. Our goal was accountability. Over time, they became more respectful, and they stopped talking about future plans involving the beach house. Eventually, they accepted that the house existed for my parents and nobody else. Almost exactly 1 year after the anniversary celebration, our entire family gathered at the beach house again. This time, everything felt completely different. Nobody was assigning rooms, and nobody was discussing future schedules. Everyone simply arrived and enjoyed being together. There was laughter everywhere, and children were running around outside, while my mother smiled and my father looked completely relaxed. During dinner, my father stood up and thanked everyone for being there. Then he said something I will never forget. He said this was the first time in a very long time that he truly felt at home again. Later that evening, we sat on the porch watching the sunset while the sky turned orange and pink above the ocean. My mother looked at me and asked if I regretted buying the house after everything that had happened. I smiled immediately because the answer was simple. I told her no. Despite every uncomfortable conversation and despite every challenge we faced, the house still accomplished its purpose. It gave them peace, and peace is priceless. Then my father reminded me of something my grandfather used to say. He believed generosity should always come with wisdom because helping people should never come at the expense of your own happiness. Looking back now, I realize this story was never truly about a beach house. It was about protecting something beautiful before somebody slowly took it away. If there is one lesson I hope people remember, it is this. Never feel guilty for protecting what you worked hard to build. Never allow someone to convince you that boundaries are selfish, because boundaries are not walls that push people away. Boundaries are doors with locks, and the people who truly love you will always respect those locks because respect is one of the purest forms of love. 1 year ago, I bought my parents their dream beach house for their 50th anniversary. At that time, I thought the greatest gift I was giving them was a beautiful home by the ocean. Looking back now, I realized the greatest gift was protecting that dream once it was threatened, because dreams are fragile, and sometimes they do not just need to be created. Sometimes they need to be defended. After everything we went through, I would defend that dream 1,000 times over again, because seeing my parents happy was worth every difficult conversation we had to face along the way.